Welcome once again to another episode of CrossPolitic Countdown. I'm Andrew Southwick. Today, joined by Brigadier General. I know you just want me to call you Chris, but I've got to let him know. Brigadier General Chris Sage and Attorney Davis Younts. We're going to have a conversation here in just a minute. One that needs a lot more attention than it's getting. Right off the bat, I want to remind you. Any of our articles on CrossPolitic News, you can find that at crosspoliticnews.com. That is crosspoliticnews.com. And for those of you who have, I don't know what the equivalent of eagle eyes is, but fantastic hearing. You'll notice my voice sounds a little weird. Yes, I did catch one of those winter bugs, and so hopefully it won't be too much of a distraction for us. I will do my best not to talk too much, but I do want to set up the scene. One of the latest articles from CrossPolitic News, written by our own managing editor, Justin Chartrey, brings a developing story that needs far more attention than it's getting. Brigadier General Christopher Sage, one of the Air Force's most decorated leaders, is facing a forced retirement after a 4-year battle tied to how he had led during the COVID era and COVID era policies during his deployment. Sage made what he calls common sense decisions, from reopening base facilities to pushing back against overbearing pandemic restrictions, only to be targeted by a Pentagon Inspector General investigation and have his promotion to Major General revoked. Now, earlier this year, a Trump-era military review board cleared Sage, affirming his record and ruling the case illegitimate. But Pentagon leadership reversed that decision, leaving Sage's future and his name on the line as the December 31st forced retirement deadline is fast approaching. Chris, thank you again for being with us. I want to start with you. Will you just lead us up to how you entered onto the base? I know when you first arrived, you described it as internment camp style. What were your initial impressions leading up to this, and then how did that influence and impact your decisions as to how you led before we get to the investigation?
Well, Andrew, first of all, thank you for having me and Davis on your show tonight. It's great to have a platform to be able to tell this story. And the reason why that's important, Andrew, is because this is not just about my case. This is about thousands of airmen, soldiers, Marines, Coast Guardsmen who have been persecuted because of COVID era policies. Some forced out, and many stepped away, walked away without before they were forced out. So we're talking tens of thousands of people. And over the last 4 years, I've been able to meet many of these young airmen, young soldiers, captains, majors, sergeants that have come to me and shared their story and have encouraged me to keep fighting. Very blessed to have the resources to do that and the time to do that. And I do need to start by just clarifying that I'm acting in my personal capacity as a private citizen. So nothing that I say tonight reflects the Air Force or the Department of War, and they're my own thoughts as I'm off duty at this time. To answer your question, Andrew, very blessed over the last 31 and a half years to have a lot of great leadership opportunities. And it was a dream of mine when I found out that I was selected to lead a very large combat wing in the Middle East, and over 2,000 airmen and soldiers that were there. A great team that was there, great airmen that were carrying out the mission every day when I arrived. To your question, what I witnessed when I first arrived was the sort of the mentality that I think had come from the United States when it came to COVID era policies. For example, one of the first things I did within the first few days is said, hey, I'd like to go visit some of our airmen who are unfortunately, sick with the virus. So at the time, we probably had about 10 airmen that were they told me they were in an isolation tent. So I said, well, hey, take me to see these airmen. I'd love to meet them, encourage them. And when we got there, I quickly realized, okay, the isolation tent was surrounded by barbed wire. So we had sick airmen in a tent surrounded by barbed wire. When I asked to go see the airmen, I was told it's very dangerous, even though, most of them were vaccinated. And it was just, it was basically like a bad cold. So they made me put on scrubs. They wanted me to put on a mask, wanted me to put on gloves. So when I went into the tent, I clearly remember saying, you know what, these are just sick airmen. I can wash my hands when I leave. I walked up and I shook the hands of every one of them that was not sleeping. So when I left, and I washed my hands when I left. When I left that, I talked to my commanders when I left the tent, and I said, hey, these airmen are not prisoners. They're sick. So not only did I order in a very polite and kind way within my authority for us to tear down that barbed wire, but then when the numbers dropped below the number of VIP quarters we had, we moved them into the VIP quarters so they could have internal plumbing. So that's just a little snapshot of a few of the decisions I made. I also opened I opened our gyms up, first base in the Middle East to open our gyms, because I'd rather have healthy airmen than isolated airmen. There was a policy that came out at one point where we had to wear masks indoors and outdoors. And as you might imagine, in the Middle East, 110-degree heat, our airmen are operating underneath loud jets. Wearing a mask outdoors is absolutely ridiculous. So me, along with some other commanders at the other bases, signed orders to rescind that recommendation, which it was a recommendation. And we did. And this is just one of the many policies that was under the backdrop of my time deployed, where COVID was at its peak.
I want to ask a little bit about making some of those decisions on the ground. From a civilian. I won't pretend to know anything about how the chain of command really works, other than one above another. If it wasn't in a few good men, I don't know much about it, right? So, but you had to balance the scientific uncertainty. You had to balance troop welfare, command responsibility when making these choices. One of your quotes was that you were doing research that masks didn't work, and one thing after another, that you were making prudent decisions that were common sense. But apparently, those decisions ruffled some higher up feathers in terms of policy. How do you decide whether or not I'm going to go along with what I'm told we're supposed to do, or I'm going to make this common sense decision? How are you weighing that in those moments?
Andrew used the exact word I was about to use. Every decision was just common sense. And the second thing was, it was putting the welfare of the airmen first. And then the third thing was, it was accomplishing the mission. And we were able to do all three of those at the same time: accomplish the mission, make common sense decisions, and put the welfare of the airmen first. To your point, yes. So I'm fortunate, blessed to have some doctor friends back in the US that were dealing with these issues. They were pushing me articles, peer review articles from Harvard, Brown, Johns Hopkins, that were, saying things like, hey, the cheap Chinese masks that everybody touches, every 3 minutes, they're ineffective. If you're going to wear a mask, it needs to be the N95 mask, and you're going to have to change it out quite often. But regardless, there was also in the literature, it was coming out that, hey, vitamins can make a difference. Vitamin D can make a difference. So one of the things I really pushed for was that we create vitamin packs for all of our airmen, and that got met with serious resistance. At one point, our airmen we had like 400 to 800 airmen total that were rotating into the base. And by the way, these airmen had all been tested in the US. I think most of them had been vaccinated. So I found out, because they didn't tell me originally, was that the doctors had set up another testing line when they landed. And we had one airman who had no symptoms, but popped positive. Could have been a false positive. It's no way to know. And it shut down the entire in-processing line of these airmen that were coming into combat. So I just made a real-time, prudent leadership decision. It was not emotional at all. Just said, hey, we're going to keep in-processing the airmen. We're just going to not do that test. We had other tests that we could do later. It was no issue. And Andrew, this is how I knew that we were making common sense decisions. We had the lowest COVID numbers of any air base, and probably any base total in the Middle East. We had the lowest total numbers, and we had the total lowest percentage. And like I say, in my mind, common sense, we're going to exercise, we're going to eat healthy, we're going to get airmen, outside in the daylight, in the sun, all the things that we knew that would help our airmen survive this time that we were going through. The investigates, part of the investigation, they're going to say, well, COVID was only a portion of it. During the 6-month window of the investigation, COVID was the backdrop for every decision that we made, which is why, and I'm sure we'll get to it later, the Board of Corrections of Military Records deemed exactly that COVID influenced the actions that were taken against me during and after the investigation.
Yes, I do want to get to the allegations here in just a moment. I want to follow up on one thing that you mentioned. You wanted vitamin packs for the troops there, and that was met with resistance. Do you have any idea as to why something as simple like that would be met with any kind of resistance at all?
Andrew, it's a great question, and it's one that I spent a lot of time thinking about because it's systematic. It's entrenched sort of sometimes in the bureaucracy. If it was not DOD policy or Air Force policy at the time or CDC policy, then there were people, unfortunately, that were under my command that then spoke out negatively about me. That if it almost became like a religion. Unless it was written down and it was passed down from on high, they were opposed to it. Where I came at this with a novel approach, just like I would with anything. We're going to problem solve this. We're going to work our way through it. We're going to do it with a smile. We're going to do it with dignity and respect. And we're going to help these airmen get through it. So once again, I had been reading articles, peer-reviewed articles that said, hey, we're seeing in the research now in the literature that if you increase your vitamin D, you increase your zinc, you increase your overall vitamin count, then you can actually have either less side effects or you can actually avoid this virus. The healthiest people at our base were the ones, shockingly, that were not picking up the virus. And I think opening the gyms did help, treating our airmen like normal people, allowing, delegating these decisions down to the front lines. And I can tell you right now, Andrew, the maintenance troops on the flight line absolutely loved this decision because they knew in their heart made no sense to be crawling under a loud jet with a Chinese mask on their face. Not only was it not good for the airmen, but there was also a risk to the aircraft if one got sucked down the engine. It was just common sense, prudent decisions.
I got one more question here for you, Chris, and I do want to bring Davis in here and talk a little bit about how he came into the picture. But as leading up to Davis's introduction into your story, tell us about the allegations. When did these things, the official allegations, begin? What were some of them? And then, what led you to reaching out and then bringing Davis into the story?
Well, thank you, Andrew. When you're in leadership, and I've been very blessed to be asked to lead numerous times, it's natural that you're not going to have 100% of your followers, in lockstep behind you. There's always going to be detractors. There's always going to be a small percentage of people who just can't get on board with the mission or the vision. And in this case, there was one individual in particular that right after he deployed or as he was deploying, he levied 7 borderline criminal allegations against me. Most of them were related to fraud, waste, and abuse. One of them was a hostile work environment. And the interesting thing is that this individual was in a position where he would have known the definitions. He would have known the threshold required to make these type of allegations. The good news was, which is often the case, people make allegations, it's quickly investigated, and all 7 of these allegations were thrown out. However, in that investigation, the investigator heard from a few of my detractors who just did not agree with my leadership style, did not agree with the decisions I make. It was never about hostile work environment. It was never about yelling, raising my voice, throwing something, demeaning anyone in public. It was just about not agreeing with my decisions and then saying things to the investigator like, he really hurt my feelings, or I don't think, a lot of leading questions. I don't think he trusted me the way that I thought he would trust me, even though it was someone 2 levels below me in the chain of command, even though it was someone on their first combat deployment, where this was my 7th combat deployment. A very, very busy time where we were basically prosecuting the attack against ISIS. We were prosecuting the attack against Iranian-backed militias. We were participating in training events with the Egyptians, the Israelis, the Jordanians, the French, and we were also forward deploying to support the efforts in Afghanistan to support basically the air mission over Kabul near the end of the evacuation. So a very busy time. I used my chain of command effectively. I had a group of colonels below me who then had the squadron commanders below them. So then the investigator which normally you would do the investigation when they're all thrown out, you just move on. In this case, he was allowed by the IG at the time to create a brand new allegation. So he had to water it down. He created a new allegation that said, well, even though it wasn't a hostile work environment, a few people claim that General Sage failed to establish and maintain a healthy command climate. And what's interesting in this, one quick comment, and then I'll get off the stage for Davis, is through these allegations, my lawyer, my defense team at the time, pointed out the fact that the allegation applied to the entire base. It said the command climate for the entire wing of 2,000 people. And the investigator basically narrowed it down to about 10 people. So we pointed out that, hey, this is a very small subset of people that have said something negative. And when you actually look at their statements, my lawyers pointed this out, it was really about 6 detractors and then about 4 people that were asked leading questions. So in order to substantiate this allegation, they had to adopt the same theory that we presented to them in our defense, which was the only way they got to this, this allegation across the finish line was by reducing it to a smaller and smaller group of people. So then they actually, when they wrote the final report, they used that same language in their report to reach the threshold of an allegation or to substantiation. So we fought that for about 4 years until last month, we finally took it to the Board of Corrections for Military Records at the invitation of the Air Force, and we won. It was overturned because they looked at it. Davis will talk more about this. They looked at it and said, Brigadier General Sage's views on COVID and his actions on COVID, there was enough evidence to show that by preponderance of the evidence affected the actions that were taken against me, the negative actions that were taken against me.
Davis, let's bring you in here. Tell us how you first became involved with Chris and his case, and then also off of that, explain how the investigation, as it's shifting targets, as Chris is explaining a little bit, how that you quote us that the investigation did not substantiate, that's the word I'm looking for, the original allegations, but pivoted to the command climate failure. How you responded to that restructuring in the early days of your involvement.
Yeah, so I got involved in this case for a couple of different reasons. One is just mutual Christian friends that introduced me and gave me background on General Sage's case. I was heavily involved in defending hundreds of military members when it came to COVID. I myself was only able to get to 20 years of service in the Air Force as a JAG because of an injunction in federal court after my religious accommodations were denied. So COVID was something very personal to me, and I've been engaged in this fight from the beginning, fighting for all kinds of service members as it relates to COVID, and still engaging in the fight for accountability and really just recognizing what the Biden administration did, why it was illegal, why it was a violation of constitutional rights, and really how it became a purge. It became an opportunity for an administration during the Biden years that was just run through with Marxists, secular humanists, to purge Christians, to purge people of faith like General Sage in this. So I got involved in this case because I was asked to, particularly because of what happened with the BCMR decision. And I cannot emphasize this enough. And it's not going to be something that people necessarily understand without digging into the weeds a little bit. But just think of it this way. There are not a lot of opportunities for military members of any rank to address harms against them outside of trying to go to federal court and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and often getting denied at the courthouse steps. So what happened is there's this process. It's a very formal, very established process called the Board of Corrections for Military Records. Each branch of service has it, and it is the process where any military member of any rank can apply to that board and say, hey, here is an error in my military record that needs to be fixed, either for legal or equitable reasons. It needs to be fixed. So it could be something as simple as not having not having recognition for a medal that's been awarded. It could have to do with service time credit. It could have to do with promotions or other things. And so what happened in this case, as the Air Force and the Department of War has asked all military members who were harmed because of COVID to do, is you go through the process. So in this case, Chris did that. Chris went through the BCMR process. It went to the BCMR. The BCMR voted by 2-1 vote to give him relief because they found that it was likely his stance on COVID impacted the decisions that were made against him. So a huge win. And then after that, bureaucratic functionaries within the Pentagon did something that is almost unprecedented. It is not wholly unprecedented, but it's almost unprecedented in overturning that decision. There's no documentation of why. There's no evidence of why. There's no justification that we can respond to explain why they did that. But Chris followed the process. And so here we are. So I think it's really important to give that background because, we're talking about, when we talk about Chris's case, we're talking about someone who's not only one of the most highly decorated combat pilots in the Air Force, but we're talking about a general officer, someone who has resources, connections, friends who know him, who know who he is, who know the kind of man that he is, and can try to weigh in and help. And he has the resources to go through this process. Well, what about the airmen out there? What about the junior, the brand new guys with no resources, no money that have been told, well, we're not going to grant relief. We're not going to do the right thing as far as accountability goes for COVID, but you can apply to the Board of Corrections to get relief. I mean, that underlines all of this. That's the backdrop to all of this, because what we see in Chris's case, when we talk about these moving allegations and things like that, and to be clear, I recently got involved in this case after the BCMR decision. I wasn't involved in the investigation, but as a former Air Force prosecutor, as a former Air Force Defense Counsel, as someone who retired as a lieutenant colonel, I have dealt with these issues. They were bad during the Obama administration. They became just weaponized during the Biden administration, where consistent with Marxist principles, there's this whole oppressed versus oppressor mindset. And it was taking over the military during the Biden administration, just like it's taken over so many institutions. And this investigation is an example of that. I have clients like Chris who are just targeted because they're Bible believing Christians, and not even for things they said or did, but just because of perception of their beliefs. Similar to what Chris did, because he was willing to speak out on behalf of his airmen, these men and women who were serving with him, to try to protect them and help them during this time of COVID. And they weaponized the process against him, death by 1,000 administrative cuts, to just find a way to have a substantiated IG complaint against him. And the problem is, just like in any tyrannical state, when you have bureaucratic methods like this to destroy people, destroy their reputation and career, that can be utilized and weaponized against him. And that's really what happened. So I'm sorry to go on and just kind of get on my pedestal there, but this case is so important because this is just the tip of the iceberg of what needs to be done to help restore our military and restore accountability. And what's fascinating is, this case really is an example of what Secretary of War Hegseth talked about when he came out with his no more walking on eggshells policy. This is exactly that. This was a weaponized process, a weaponized investigation to allow a couple of disgruntled subordinates who didn't like Chris's faith. They didn't like what he was doing with regard to COVID, and they didn't like the fact that he actually bothered to try to hold people accountable and get the mission done. And that's a huge issue, and it's part of why some of the leaders in the Pentagon right now have been working so hard to restore accountability and to solve some of these issues that were created by the Biden administration.
I have a couple of follow-ups for you, Davis, and then I do want to bring in Chris, your faith and how that is guiding you here in just in our last few minutes here. Davis, we're talking. You've mentioned, actually, both of you have talked about how Chris has the resources to do this. He's a highly decorated pilot. Is part of this because legally, or just from a legal standpoint, if you can establish this precedent, that precedent would help those coming behind him? Is that part of the reason for this, or for
absolutely?
What
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can share, what I know of Chris's heart on this is this is not about him. This is not about self-promotion. This is not about anything other than trying to use the platform that God has given him to shed light on a serious problem, because the issues at the Pentagon, they run deep. I mean, 32,000 people work at the Pentagon every day. There's a lot of holdovers from previous administrations, and there's a lot of the same people that developed, these draconian COVID policies that just decided that the law didn't matter when it came to COVID, and they were just going to violate the law anyway. So a lot of those people are there. So even when you have very, very good leaders within the Pentagon, leaders like Secretary of War Hegseth, leaders like, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force Matt Lohmeyer, these are good men. They're trying to do a lot of the right things. But a case like this, Chris's case, this isn't about him, and I can share his heart with you on that. But the reality is, if he can't get relief, if he goes to the BCMR, wins at the BCMR, that's the process that everyone is supposed to use. And then it's just going to be overturned without justification, without explaining why, without giving him an opportunity to respond to whatever it is that they're using to justify overturning this decision. That undermines the process. And yes, this is about the precedent that sets for others, because I have hundreds of airmen, of soldiers, of Marines, of members of the Navy, the Coast Guard that are trying to get relief. They're trying to put their lives back together after they were destroyed over things that happened during the COVID era. And they're being told, go through the BCMR, go through the BCMR, go through the BCMR. Well, if a general officer, if a hero, if a highly decorated pilot, demonstrated, documented leader with an incredible career goes to the BCMR, follows the process, wins, and it's just going to be overturned by bureaucratic functionaries, that's a problem. And that process is a huge concern, and we have to address it because that does set precedent.
And Davis, lastly, for you and your team had outlined multiple procedural irregularities through this, including that the investigator never visited the deployment location. And as Chris mentioned before, only a fraction of the witnesses were interviewed. In your view, again, legally speaking, do these omissions reflect, or how do these? Let me rephrase. Do these omissions first? Do you think they're undermining confidence in the investigative process, particularly for some of the people coming behind Chris Sage? And then also, do you, in your view, does this open the door to, or we're dealing with different kind of bias or procedural breakdowns within our military just as a system?
Yeah. So what has happened? And again, Secretary of War Hegseth has addressed this by talking about the problem with these investigations. But what the Biden administration allowed to happen is that all of these minor administrative processes within the military could be weaponized against good leaders. So any disgruntled subordinate in the military system could file an IG complaint or an EO complaint. And the result is, regardless of what the evidence is, regardless of the lack of evidence, the result is it destroys careers. And so the problem that we see in this case is just a great example of that. We have an investigating officer who was essentially pushed rogue. The initial allegations had no merit, and yet the investigation became an investigation in search of something as opposed to actually a free and fair investigation. So not only is it a violation of fundamental concepts that we accept as part of the laws in our nation based on biblical principles like presumption of innocence and administrative due process, but what we see is we truly have a military where the subordinates are running the show, and anyone can make an IG complaint at any time. It can have absolutely no merit. But if we don't do things like interview right witnesses, actually conduct an investigation based on the presumption of innocence, anyone in the military could be subject to false allegations. There could be a poorly done investigation, and it can ruin careers. And that is something that happens over and over and over again. And again, a lot of this started in the Biden administration, in the Obama administration, truthfully, and then was just ramped up in the Biden administration because, and again, this may sound like extreme, but we have to look for trends. We have to understand this. This really deals with secular humanism, Marxist ideas, where it's not about truth. It's not about objective truth and principles. It's simply about oppressed and oppressor, and does a subordinate feel sad? And we say that as a joke, but I make that joke with my law partner all the time. I say, oh, okay, there's these allegations against our client who's had this impeccable career. And I'm like, oh, but was someone sad? Did what he said and saying, please do your job, make someone sad? Because if it did, then we should probably court-martial them in their career. So that's what we're dealing with here, but that's why it's so important. And again, you saw during the Biden administration, you saw an absolute recruiting crisis. You've seen recruiting get better under this Trump term because of leaders in the Pentagon that are working towards accountability. But if we don't see meaningful reform, if some of these things don't get executed effectively moving forward, we're going to see a recruiting crisis in the future, because there's going to be a real concern about accountability. And listen, I mean, just imagine putting yourself in the position of someone like Chris, who sacrificed and served his country for 32 years, done everything the United States Air Force has asked him to do, has left his family, has put his life at risk, has done incredible things for his nation, never questioning anything, never causing issues, unless it meant that he was fighting for airmen and fighting for common sense, fighting to accomplish the mission in a way that honors our nation. And a simple allegation motivated by bias because of a stand on COVID that was just allowed to morph and continue to grow and twist and turn until they could come up with something so ambiguous as failing to maintain a proper command climate, so ambiguous as that, and only relying on a couple people and not even doing face-to-face interviews. So again, I could talk about this all day because it's such a significant problem. It's something we're very passionate about at our firm, but this case is a great example of that.
All right, Chris, gentlemen, we have just, excuse me. Excuse me. I know we have just a couple more minutes left. Let me bring this back up here. Once I did that, my screen froze. There we go. We've talked about you won at the Board for Correction of Military Records, BCMR. Then you had that overturned by the Pentagon leadership. Then you're promoted. You have that undone. What did you feel at that moment? Take us through kind of what you were feeling in those moments. And then also, how does that progress to a forced retirement? And what does that mean?
Andrew, it's been a long road, 4 years, but at the end of the day, I would walk away tomorrow if I can just clear my name and I can continue to stand up for the other airmen that are going through this process right now. I have 5 children, so every decision that I've made in my life is a reflection on them. It's a reflection on my family. It's a reflection on my faith. And the reality is, it's just been very frustrating. But the good news is there have been moments of hope. The first was after the investigation was, first of all of the strong leaders, which is every single one of my enlisted force, my command chief and every group chief, my chief master sergeants at the base, my first sergeants, they all supported me 100%. They all wrote letters later that because the investigator did not interview them, they basically volunteered to write letters on my behalf after the fact. And speaking of the investigation, my interview lasted 7 hours. 7 hours with questions like this. So why how do you think this decision made that lieutenant colonel feel? And I said, well, I don't know, because I made a decision and then his boss, who's a colonel, then took that decision to him. So you would have to ask his boss. But the investigator was so focused on my decisions and how it made people feel, as Davis pointed out, that the interview lasted 7 hours as we walked through hundreds of those types of questions. But there was hope, Andrew. And that's when I got back to NATO. This investigation lasted 11 months, by the way. 11 months. I was done with command. We had all redeployed. There was no rights that were going to be wronged 11 months later. And when the report reached my chain of command, a 3-star and a 4-star, they looked at all the facts. They reviewed all the evidence. And just like the BCMR, even stronger, my chain of command said, we feel, they put in writing that General Sage's actions were appropriate if you look at the totality of the circumstances at the time. So there was vindication there. And then I thought, okay, that's fantastic. They gave me number one paperwork. They continued to push me for jobs. I was very fortunate, very blessed. So I'm thinking, okay, now we just need to get this, cleaned up out of my record. That then takes us to the BCMR, as Davis so wonderfully described, and we won. So that was the second victory that we had right there, and until it was quickly overturned. And then the third victory was when we found out, even though it's honestly a subtext here, is that when President Trump basically tweeted out twice or put in a post twice and doubled down on that post, that any item, any memo, any executive action that was signed by the auto pen is null and void. Well, it turns out that the paperwork to strip me off of the 2-star list by the previous Secretary of Defense and President was signed by the auto pen and is therefore null and void. But if I could return back to the BCMR, I'm one of the first airmen on the Air Force side out of the chute. I went into that BCMR. They took about a month and a half to 2 months to conduct the investigation. They looked at all the evidence, Andrew. They looked at all the witness testimony, and then they decided that under the 7 May guidance that came out of the Secretary of War's office, the Office for Personnel, that gave them broad discretion, they decided that my case needed to be thrown out. And as Davis said, what I fear is all these airmen that are watching this right now, who are now going to be scared to go through the BCMR, or even worse, they're just not going to want to waste their time because they see how airmen are treated. This case never would have went forward under the current policy of no more walking on eggshells. There's a few reasons. One, it says that if someone makes a false allegation that they know is false, they will be held accountable. So this investigation never would have started to begin with. And if I could pick up on the faith aspect, because I think, like both of you gentlemen, faith is core to who I am. My Christian faith, my belief in Jesus Christ as a follower of Jesus Christ, guides my worldview. My worldview then guides my leadership and guides my decisions. And it was obvious that some of these people that were pushing back on me had a very different worldview. And I can give you one example. By the way, the individual that made the false allegations against me, 7 of them, went on to be quoted 7 times in the IG report, which I think is probably illegal. At a minimum, it's unethical. And it would never fly under SecDef's policies today, SecWar's policies today. But one of the other individuals that spoke out against me, I'll never forget, I was asking questions about COVID. I wasn't even saying we're going to do this or that. I was merely asking questions. He came up to me after the meeting and said, "Sir, whenever you ask any questions about COVID, you're getting political. You need to stop being political." And I just remember thinking at the time, for me, my faith is in Jesus Christ. For this individual, unfortunately, his faith was in the religion of COVID at the time. And I was not allowed to question it. And that stuck with me ever since. And Andrew, while I have the floor, I would also like to point out how thankful I am, not only for Davis and the wonderful work that he does, but also Eli Crane, Congressman Crane, as well as Congressman Brian Mast from Florida. These 2 gentlemen led an effort to get 11 congressmen total to sign on to numerous letters questioning these decisions along the way. And I just wanted to publicly thank them because they are true patriots for helping me along the way.
You actually answered one of my next questions, which was, how has your Christian faith shaped your resilience and clarity? But I think you answered that really well. Last couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up. You estimate, maybe thousands of Air Force personnel, they left or were removed due to the COVID policies. How do you think that attrition has affected the morale, readiness, and future for the armed forces? But also, how do you think and hope that your case will affect that morale and readiness? Prayerfully, God willing, that it is a result in your favor.
That's exactly it, Andrew. God willing, this is all in God's will. God's perfect plan is weaved through this whole case. It's been, sometimes I feel humbly like I've had to bear this cross. I've carried this cross for 4 years, and that's okay. I'll carry it for another 4 years if that's what God wants me to do. But it really just comes back to those airmen that reach out to me all the time. You're right. I mean, the estimates are 8,000 people were forced out, another 70 to 80,000, kind of stepped away on their own. But for me, it's, God's perfect plan is going to be executed no matter what happens, whether I stay in the Air Force, whether I don't stay in the Air Force. But also, the Bible calls us to continue to fight for justice, to continue to fight for those who do not have a voice, and for the oppressed as well. And that's what we're doing here. Because what the decision did was it removed the decisions, removed solid American patriots from our military, and it amplified a totalitarian view of basically a persecution of these Marxist infused ideas that Davis alluded to. And we have to put a stop to that. And I just saw today where the Secretary of War is doing exactly that now with the Chaplain Corps, because it was getting out of control. It started going down a path that was not healthy. Was not the best decision for our airmen and our Marines and our soldiers. So he made that decision today. He continues to make good decisions to right these wrongs, and so do other people in the senior leader positions, such as Matt Lohmeyer, the Undersecretary of the Air Force. We're very thankful for their efforts. And last but not least, Andrew, I know that this is all because of the leadership of our Commander-in-Chief. And, I serve the Commander-in-Chief no matter who he is. I have been encouraged, though, by this Commander-in-Chief who wants to right these wrongs, has given that guidance. Secretary of War has given that guidance. And here we are. We continue to fight for justice, not just for my case, but for the many airmen that will follow me in the BCMR.
Davis, what are we waiting for? December 31st. That's the retirement deadline. So we're up against the clock as we're recording this interview. It is the 17th of December. So we're talking about 2 weeks from here. What are we looking for on December 31st? What is that day going to look like? And then coming out of that, one way or another, what does that mean?
So we are really at the mercy of the Pentagon and ultimately the President of the United States to step in, overturn this decision that overturned relief for Chris, and allow him to either clear his name and retire with dignity, or to continue to serve. Whatever it is, he's willing to do that. So that's really what we're waiting for. We're sort of down to the final hour, hoping and praying that people within the Pentagon as well as the White House will look at this, will understand the background, and will see why this case is so important, and will have an impact on the force. So that's really it. That's what we're waiting for. So, what can people do? People can pray. People can pray hard. People can contact their senators and congressmen. People can follow this story, share this story. We are getting some movement from the Pentagon. We are getting some response because of media coverage like this to this, and at least conversations are happening. People are looking at this. So we don't know what God's plan is. We don't know what the outcome is. But we know this story needs to be told, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. So whether or not Chris gets relief, there are so many others, many we represent that need this relief, and we just need people to understand. And again, just understand the perspective of so many of my clients. I mean, I'm thinking Navy SEALs, fighter pilots, so many people, the best of the best that were forced out over this purge when it comes to COVID. They're sitting there, and many of them were nothing. Some of them were homeless. Some of them spent essentially 2 years in limbo. Their careers are destroyed. Now they're still getting out. So even those that survived this and stayed in, they're getting out as soon as they can because of what happened, and they're not seeing meaningful accountability on this. When the Obama administration came in, they gave constructive retirements to anyone who left the military over the don't ask, don't tell policy. Even the current administration is looking at giving separation pay to those that are transgender and serving in the military. And people are looking around, Christian men and women, those who love their country, just wanted to serve through COVID, tried to do the right things, tried to follow the process. They've been left with nothing, and they've been left, unfortunately, so far with a process that's not working for the vast majority of them. And so, my prayer, my hope is by drawing attention to this case that we'll see relief for Chris, for his family, we'll be able to clear his name, but that there will be continued attention on this as we work towards restoration. And I do think President Trump's heart's in the right place. I think the Secretary of War has the right heart on this. I think guys like Matt Lohmeyer within the Pentagon have the right heart on this, but it takes hard work. And I do think there is a tremendous amount of bureaucratic resistance to any meaningful change. And I think there are many, many bureaucrats who simply went along with the unlawful orders as it relates to COVID, went along with discriminating against people because of their faith, and who have been discriminating against Christians throughout the last 4 years, that don't want to acknowledge what happened and don't want to acknowledge change. And my hope in being a part of this, being a part of Chris's story, is that we can continue to draw attention to that.
All right, Chris, I want to give you the last word. If you had 2 minutes to speak directly to the American people, even from the White House briefing room, perhaps, about leadership, justice, service in this era, how faith defines those things, what would your message be, especially to fellow believers and the young men and women who might be considering military service at this time?
Well, Andrew, thank you. We have the best country in the history of the world, the country that's done more good than any other country to bring people out of poverty, to free them from slavery, to free them from oppression of foreign powers. And that's a legacy that we should not take for granted. And we should build on that for the future. And that's why the American people are watching this very closely. Regardless of what happens to me in 14 days, I'm going to walk out of here thankful, with a smile on my face, full of joy for a wonderful 32 years. And by the way, I still have my family intact around me, to include my wonderful wife of almost 30 years and my 5 children. So I'm very thankful for that. But my message would be, this is serious business. The Department of the War is about protecting our way of life, protecting our nation, protecting our liberties, and we have to take it seriously. We have to correct the wrongs of the past, and we have to build a stronger future. And I believe that the Secretary of War is doing that, and I believe the President's doing that. And if the President's listening to this, I would say, Mr. President, continue to keep the pressure on to make the positive changes that need to happen inside our military as we go forward, so we can continue to be the most lethal fighting force that the world has ever seen. And it's been an honor to be a part of that. And it's been an honor to be with you today. So thank you, Andrew.
Chris Sage, Davis Younts, thank you for your generosity of time and sharing your story with us. I'm sure God is going to continue to help bring awareness to it. And we encourage those of you who are watching this program, it's a call to your senator, a call to your congressman in the next couple of weeks, week and a half, that can help Chris in his case. And of course, we are all trusting God for that, no matter what the outcome is. It is in his hands. That's going to do it for this episode of CrossPolitic Countdown. Remember, you can find this article by Justin Chartree on CrossPoliticNews.com. That's CrossPoliticNews.com, or at CPUSA on X, at CPUSA on X. For Chris Sage and and Davis Younts, pardon my voice, I'm Andrew Southwick. Until next time, so long.